When you think of Alabama, what comes to mind? Well, its story is one of profound and, often really turbulent transformation. We're talking about a journey from the great earthen mounds of a forgotten civilization all the way to the rocket factories that helped put us on the moon. So let's dive into the history of a state that has been, in so many ways, right at the center of the American experience.
So here's how we're going to break it down. We're going to journey through 5 major eras to really get a handle on how Alabama became the state it is today. We'll start with its deep indigenous roots, move to the rise of the Cotton Kingdom, then through the fire of the Civil War and Reconstruction. After that, we'll see its pivotal role in the fight for civil rights, and finally, its emergence as a modern industrial state.
All right, let's kick things off by rewinding the clock. I mean, way, way back. Long before any European ships even dreamed of reaching its shores, the land we now call Alabama was home to some incredibly sophisticated and thriving civilizations. Just take a look at this timeline for a second to get a sense of the scale we're dealing with. We're not talking hundreds of years, we're talking literally thousands. For over 13,000 years, native peoples lived here. The absolute peak of this was the Mississippian culture. They built these incredible urban centers like Moundville, a complex society with huge earthwork mounds that you can still see today. And then, as you can see, the arrival of Europeans in the 1500s. Well, that changed everything. For the next couple of centuries, Alabama was basically a hot potato. You had the Spanish, the French, and the English all fighting for control, setting up forts and trading with native tribes like the Creek and Choctaw. After a whole lot of conflict and treaties, the land eventually came under American control. First, it was part of the Mississippi Territory in 1798, and then, in 1817, it officially became the Alabama Territory, which paved the way for it to become a state. Next up, we're entering an era that would really define Alabama for a century or more. Right after it became a state in 1819, its entire destiny got tangled up with one single, incredibly powerful crop. And that crop, of course, was cotton. This was the age of the Cotton Kingdom. The invention of the cotton gin basically flipped a switch, turning Alabama's fertile Black Belt region into some of the most valuable farmland on the planet. This created just staggering wealth for a white planter class, but let's be absolutely clear. It was all built on a foundation of unimaginable brutality, the forced labor of enslaved African Americans. To really understand the scale of what we're talking about, I want you to just look at this number, 435,000. By 1860, right on the edge of the Civil War, that's how many enslaved people were in Alabama. This wasn't just part of the economy, it was the economy. And to put that number into even sharper perspective, that was nearly half, 45%, of the state's entire population. Think about that. Almost 1 out of every 2 people was enslaved. The economy, the social structure, the politics, you name it, it all revolved around preserving this one institution. So when tensions over slavery finally boiled over across the nation, Alabama didn't hesitate. It was one of the very first states to secede from the Union. And its capital, Montgomery, literally became the cradle of the Confederacy. That's where Jefferson Davis was inaugurated. The Civil War that followed was an absolute catastrophe for the state, costing thousands of lives and leaving its economy in ruins. Okay, so the war's over, the Confederacy is defeated. What now? Well, Alabama enters this incredibly contentious period called Reconstruction. And this wasn't just a battle over rebuilding roads and farms, it was a battle for the very soul of the state. What kind of society was going to rise from the ashes? What you see here is basically a massive tug of war. For a brief, incredible moment, you had this biracial Republican coalition making huge strides. I mean, they created the state's first ever public school system for all kids and expanding voting rights to formerly enslaved men. But this progress was met with a fierce and often violent pushback. By 1874, conservative white Democrats, who called themselves Redeemers, had retaken control. Their goal was simple: turn back the clock. And the Redeemers made their power permanent with a new state constitution in 1901. Let's not mince words here. This document was specifically designed to strip African Americans of their right to vote. And while they were at it, it also suppressed the votes of poor whites who might challenge their power. They did this with things like poll taxes and literacy tests that were, of course, applied completely unfairly. And if you want to see how effective that constitution was, just look at this chart. It's stunning. In these 14 majority Black counties, you go from more than 79,000 registered voters in 1900 down to just over 1,000 by 1903. In just 3 years, The black vote was effectively wiped out for generations to come. So, this system of white supremacy really defined life in Alabama for the first half of the 20th century. But, even then, there were these powerful forces bubbling up just beneath the surface. The stage was being set for a second and maybe even more profound transformation. You had a few big things happening all at once. First, tens of thousands of African Americans left the state as part of the Great Migration. At the same time, Birmingham just exploded into this industrial powerhouse. They called it the Magic City. The Great Depression, of course, hit the state's rural economy hard. But then World War II came along and injected a ton of federal money and jobs, and that really started to modernize the state. So you put all that together. People moving to cities, new industries, soldiers coming home from war with a whole new perspective on the world, and suddenly you have the perfect storm for a direct challenge to the Jim Crow system. Which brings us to the big question, right? How on earth did Alabama, a state with such deeply entrenched segregation, become ground zero for the civil rights movement? Well, the simple answer is because activists chose to make it the battleground. The nation's and the world's attention was focused on Alabama because of these critical events. The Montgomery bus boycott, which lasted for over a year, the shocking images from Birmingham of children being blasted with fire hoses, the absolute horror of a church bombing that killed 4 little girls, and of course, the bloody march from Selma to Montgomery that shamed the nation into action. And it worked. As brutal and tragic as these events were, they were impossible to ignore. The struggle in Alabama, led by figures like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., is a direct line to the passage of the landmark Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It literally changed the nation forever. So, in the wake of the civil rights movement, Alabama really began to forge a new identity. It started to pivot away from its old agricultural past and embrace a future built on technology and advanced manufacturing. And a key driver of this change was, of all things, the space race. Seriously, Huntsville up in northern Alabama became an absolutely critical hub for NASA. We're talking about the place that developed the Saturn V rocket, the beast that took astronauts to the moon. Talk about a complete change in identity. Then, in the later part of the 20th century, another industry came along and transformed the economy again. Major international car companies, Mercedes-Benz, Hyundai and others, started building these massive plants in Alabama. This created a whole new industrial backbone for the state, with tens of thousands of jobs, and it diversified the economy in a huge way. At the same time all this is happening, the political map is getting completely redrawn. For about 100 years, Alabama was a locked-in part of the Democratic Solid South. But as the National Democratic Party embraced civil rights, many white voters began to switch sides. That shift accelerated over decades, and today, Alabama is one of the most reliably Republican states in the country. So when you look at the whole picture, from ancient mounds to modern rockets, from cotton fields to car factories, you see this constant negotiation. It's a history that's just packed with deep contradictions. Conflict and progress, injustice and the fight for justice. And it really makes you wonder, how will this ongoing conversation between a very complex past and an ambitious future shape its next chapter? To continue exploring the complex tapestry of American history, go ahead and check out another explainer in our U.S. State Histories playlist. And of course, be sure to subscribe to Notebook Summaries so you never miss a thing.